With such a topic, such a wide topic, and also an audience coming from so many disciplines, it's a little difficult to work out at what level to speak. If I were to explain why I think that we are overpopulated and are doing unacceptable environmental damage to Australia as a result, I think the people from the biological sciences would feel as if I was explaining that B comes after A and C follows B. On the other hand, in some disciplines, these connections are not seen. I can remember at a seminar some years ago, one of the legendary economic names of the ANU, since deceased, took me aside and pityingly explained that my fear about overpopulation leading to world famine was naive. He said, if food ever became short, this would drive up the price. This would thus give farmers an incentive to produce more. They would therefore clear more land and the price of food would go down again. And no, he wasn't just mentioning that that is an issue, as it is. To him, that was the answer. That solved the problem. On the other hand, I received a very supportive email from an ANU economist this morning after talking on Life Matters. So one mustn't put all economists by any means in that cornucopian basket. Let me just go through some absolute basics that may not be absolutely known to everyone. Basics of Australia. The UN's Population Fund is concerned that population growth in the Asian region averages 1.1% a year. Australia, as a first world country, should have a much lower growth rate. It does not. By the end of the Howard era, our annual population growth had risen to a stunning 1.5%, almost off the first world scale, and high even for third world countries. Indonesia is rejoicing in having, with much effort, got its population growth rate down from 1.3 to 1.2. Australia is making no effort whatever, or rather an effort in the opposite direction, and has pushed it up, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, via 1.6 to 1.8, which was the figure when this book came out quite recently, and which some of the graphs I've got still show. More recently, ABS says 1.9, but of course its reliable hindsight involves taking the figures from a few months back. Tim Colbatch has recently published a credible article in The Age suggesting that the figure for Australia's population growth is now 2% per annum. Those of you who are familiar with the banker's rule of thumb, that at compound interest, 1% interest makes a sum grow in 70 years, double in 70 years, or at 2% you double in 35 years, and that's exactly the relevant issue. 35 years from now would be 2044, so presumably our 22 million, if we keep this current crazy growth rate, would be 44 million Australians. We would pass 50 million before mid-century and be way over 100 million by the end of the century. As you know, it would require considerable optimism to believe Australia's desert continent could even feed 100 million people, even on the assumption that both oil and oil-based fertilisers, above all nitrate fertilisers, and oil-transported heavy fertilisers, above all phosphates, would remain cheaply available. As you remember, when oil hit $100 a barrel, food riots broke out. The third world, since the Green Revolution, is just as dependent on artificial nitrate fertilisers as the first, except in some parts of Africa. Tim Flannery some years ago published a rather rough calculation, variously reported as that Australia's safe population limit was 6 to 12 million, and on another occasion he said 8 to 12 million. Obviously it's very hard to know what some of the risks are, but obviously peak oil and peak fertiliser, peak phosphorus, peak nitrate are among them. A much more conservative figure was put up by the Australian Academy of Science in 1994, when after a major conference it informed the Hawke Keating government that 23 million should be Australia's safe limit. We are now almost on that and going past it at the speed of an express train. We used to put on an extra million people every 4 years. We've now roughly doubled that speed under the Rudd government. The 23 million figure put out in 1994 was of course not a figure that many or most people in the Academy thought was safe, but they had to offer a practical, politically practicable figure to the Hawke government, which was not only rapidly accelerating, desperate to cultivate the business classes and not to repeat what they saw as the mistakes of the Whitlam government that was brought down by attacks from the business world and the Murdoch press. And of course it also set up a whole train of rhetoric according to which anyone who thought immigration should be any lower than it currently was could only be a racist. So they were allowing the Hawke government a bit of time to turn around. It failed to do so, though you may have noticed Bob Hawke appeared on the Andrew Denton program last year, and when asked as an elder statesman how he saw the world, said the thing that most terrified him today was population growth. And he further opined, it was about time someone showed a bit of leadership on it. With the usual ABC total disinterest in population, at least in ABC TV, Andrew Denton, who's one of the most alert of ABC interviewers, totally failed to follow up that remark. So we never even discovered whether Hawke was talking of the world in general, and is one of those people who thinks overpopulation is always over there, or whether he was in fact repenting of his own policies when in government. Under Howard and Costello, we had the fascinating, very clever political scenario where, as Howard pushed immigration and population growth ever higher, offering these bizarre baby bonuses that began at $3,000 and are now $5,000, reaching $4,000 under Howard Costello, he was constantly attacked for being anti-immigration. He managed to do this by occasionally monstering a small number of asylum seekers and relying on the ignorance of much of the media, which can't distinguish immigrants from refugees. In case you're a bit vague on this, as some people are, the figures for immigration are very large. There's certainly over 200,000. And the humanitarian component, of which about half are refugees in the strict sense, is 13,500, recently pushed up by 250, not 1,000, just 250, with much ballyhoo about the government's generosity. Saddest of all, by world standards, it's a very high per capita intake. Under Kevin Rudd, who mentioned nothing about population when he ran for government, as Ross Gittins pointed out, he has no electoral mandate whatever to push population still higher. It has gone much faster. As I say, both natural increase and net migration are continuing to rise. Peter Costello, of course, was allowed to get away for years with the lie that natural increase was negative or zero. On one occasion, for instance, which we document in this book, he pointed out that Australia's population was only increasing due to immigration. In fact, natural increase was higher than net migration at the time. He was repeatedly interviewed by such fearless interviewers as Kerry O'Brien and Tony Jones, and indeed his baby bonus was mentioned. The fact that he was raiding the public purse to counter a totally imaginary shortage of people was never mentioned. So, what will all this growth do to our environment or even to our chances of feeding ourselves? Oh, and we were also supposed to be cutting down on emissions. Well, of course, you won't cut down on emissions if you're doubling population. Actually, Rudd, in a curious way, has even been using the population growth as an excuse for not reducing emissions. He's argued in international fora that because Australia has very high population growth, forced on us, as Professor Ian Lowe remarks, by intergalactic aliens, it would be inappropriate for Australia to have an emissions cap comparable to other nations. He's also pointed out that this much criticised 5 to 10% cut in national emissions that the Garnaut report came down to is really more like a 24% cut if you take population growth into account. In other words, the per capita cut is quite a swingeing one. I mean, to cut your use of energy by a quarter is not a small thing to do, not in the short term. And indeed that's true, but of course it will all be washed away by population growth. Peter Costello, as Treasurer, put out an intergenerational report, which did, like a proper Treasurer's report, take note of what our population would be in 2050. The figure he used was 28 million, and all government departments were required to make their calculations based on that figure. It was a figure of pure fantasy. As I say, current rates would have us by 2050 at over 50 million, roughly twice as high as the figure he was working on. Needless to say, most of Rudd's figures for alleged reductions in emissions have the same hopeless weakness. And of course, two of Rudd's ministers, Penny Wong and Peter Garrett, are serial deniers of the population issue. If it's ever put to them, they simply reply that population is not the issue. Technology will solve everything. Why hasn't it solved it yet? Oh, it hasn't, but it will. And of course we have the still more primitive level of argument. I should explain, as you can see, what I'm offering you is not so much the rigorous documentation of a particular set of energy data as an argument. See, there is the debate and there is the meta-debate, which is the debate about why we don't have a debate on population or why we don't have a more sensible debate on population. In this meta-debate, which is really the subject of the book that William Lyons and I did, our real point is not so much to restate, not so much to redo what many reputable scientists have done in all these areas, and not even merely to pull together a brief summary of what they've said and endorse it, but really to ask, what are the forces that stop us looking rationally at these issues? What's the undertow that prevents rational responses to them? One of the undertows then is this notion that Australia is a vast country. Boundless plains to share was actually written into the national anthem when it was selected a generation or so back. The myth that there is endless land just waiting for new immigrants to take it up. In fact, the boundary in Australia closed in the 1890s for new land, much as it did in the USA at much the same time. Since then, immigrants have in general not found land to farm. They have crowded into the cities even when they came from peasant backgrounds. As the geographer George Seddon remarked, Australia is not so much a large country in human terms as a small country with big distances between the fertile or rich areas. Even our agricultural areas are not so large or fertile as population boosters pretend. Wheat is our main crop, for instance, yet France grows twice as much wheat and far more of most other crops on a fraction of the land area. Why? Because it has the two things that most of Australia lacks: fertile soil and reliable rainfall. The human as well as the natural environment deteriorates as population grows. This is another large issue from our book. 2 years ago, the New South Wales government instructed Sydney's councils to accommodate an extra 1.1 million people within 25 years. The councils, of course, protested. Bankstown, for instance, was told to build 26,000 extra residences in the same area. The councils pointed out it was impossible to reconcile this with conserving the amenity of their suburbs. In any case, of course, the recent blowouts in population mean that even these draconian plans will be overwhelmed by more people. Launching Overloading Australia in February, Bob Carr spoke brilliantly and lucidly, as he always has, on population. You may remember that even as Premier, he was capable of publishing full-page articles in the Sydney Morning Herald on why we should not be growing Australia's population. He pointed out the position in which he was placed when decisions made in Canberra forced these huge allocations of extra people upon him. And then, as he said, the city must either go up, which no one wants, creating the concrete canyons and the crowded roads, or it must expand into places like Botany Bay and Ku-ring-gai Chase that we thought we had put aside for posterity, or probably in practice it will do both. He also pointed out that he was not able to go on fighting a federal government on this because his enemies would then have used that to say that he wasn't getting on with the job. He could only occasionally raise these protests. In both Melbourne and Sydney, public transport provides a flashpoint. In Melbourne, a proposal to take the seats out of the trains brought home to citizens that Premier Brumby's plans for endless growth of Melbourne were less in their interests than in those of the big end of town. Geoffrey Rush and others stepped in, forming the Planning Backlash movement, which has been very effective in questioning these developments, which are forced on by the crazy belief the government has in endless population growth. When these are reported, particularly on ABC TV, you will hardly ever see the population issue mentioned, yet the organisers of these groups mention it constantly. However, Brumby himself actually backstepped slightly, even saying publicly, "We may be at the limits of growth." He was immediately accused of racism by the opposition leader, saying that this was scapegoating immigrants who were innocent of the effects he pointed out. I'm very pleased to say that FECCA, the Federation of Ethnic Community Councils, promptly dissociated itself from the opposition leader's claims, pointing out that it was perfectly reasonable to note the effects of population growth. Back in the Hawke-Keating days, the knee-jerk reaction to any suggestion that population growth, and therefore perhaps immigration, should be reduced was to accuse the critic of racism. That argument has rather lost its sting, in part because I think the three greatest throwers of the racism slur have all now been convicted of serious criminal offences that go directly to their credibility. And indeed, we've also seen the continuous disgracing, as the media calls it, of such disgraced businessmen who are population boosters as Steve Vizard and Richard Pratt. But meanwhile, the government still seems asleep at the wheel. The Minister for Immigration, Chris Evans, claims to foresee only a continuing modest increase in our population levels over the coming years. And in one interview for the ABC, he said that net migration was 70,000, when it was some 3 times that, according to the Bureau of Statistics. So, in the course of all this, we have actually been promised a series of points at which our population was to be capped. Bob Hawke soothingly explained that 25 million was where we would stop. Philip Ruddock regularly pointed out that it was unnecessary to have a debate on population policy because people would disagree. However, he soothingly remarked it wasn't really necessary to have the debate because, in fact, current settings would cause the population to level off at 23 million, a figure that he remarked most Australians could feel reasonably comfortable with. Unfortunately, he wasn't being quite candid because A, the current settings were leading way beyond 23 million. In fact, they're currently growing to infinity, though they weren't growing so high in Ruddock's time. And of course, he knew very well that the big boys in business, whose donations keep the two main political parties afloat, do their own research and were well aware that 23 million was not where we were heading. A little later, Ruddock spoke of 25 million as where we were heading. As I say, we're heading currently for more like 100 million at the end of the century. I should say, of course, that all these predictions are, in a sense, they're not predictions, they're projections. It's like being in a yacht. You take a particular course and someone says, where are we heading for? And the answer is New Zealand, unless we turn around. But if you do turn around, you don't get there. So all you're saying is, this is the tack we're on. If we stay on it, that's where we'll arrive. What's alarming is the political power of the forces that keep us on this tack. Our book, as it explains where the problem is in turning around, gives details of the very powerful business lobbies that have been formed. Groups like APOP, the Australian Population Institute, which I know sounds very like the demographers' professional organisation, and I don't think that's accidental, but it ain't. The conclusion that Dr. Catherine Betts and Michael Gilding reach after looking into these groups is that no matter how high immigration or natural increase are pushed by government policies, most of Australia's super rich will still want them to go still higher. Where can we go from there? I want to break off fairly early and turn this over to questions, because I think it's very likely, granted the audience we have, that the questions can take us right to the end and can pull in all the materials I haven't yet reached. What I might do, though, is quickly take you through some of the slides I have here and then turn it over to questions. Not all businessmen are passionate for growth. Peter Hall, who's published this wonderful piece, Lumberjacks in Eden, a monograph, which you can find on the internet, is quite clear that as an investment banker with squillions of other people's money to invest, it's far easier for him when the economy is growing and population is growing. But as an intelligent human being, he can see that that must not go on forever. The graphs of world population are stunning, of course, in showing us what an atypical period of the world we live in. See, there's a slight kink from the Black Death, but basically we are in uncharted territory. Another way of looking at the rate of growth is to look at how long it takes for each extra billion to be added. As you can see, it was taking 15 years for 1 billion. Now it's going to take 20 perhaps for the next billion to be added. And you will get certain right-wing groups and Vatican-funded groups saying that this is terrible. We are on the downward slide. In any graph, if you can't say that the first differential is negative, you can always say that the second or the third. If we're still increasing, perhaps the rate of increase has slipped, and this is terrible. This is a graph from our book, and like that loop thing that we had at the beginning, it's the work of Dr. John Coulter, the former Democrat leader, a very intelligent and admirable human being. But He was working on 1.8% growth. As I say, it's now 2%. You can see even on 1.8% we were headed for 100 million by the turn of the century. The human bottleneck isn't so often thought about. This is not a rigorous graph, but rather a way of making you realise that even when human population peaks, the pressure on all other species has not peaked, because billions of humans will still be living in poverty. The pressure on the other species doesn't peak until the humans have reached, as it were, maximum affluence, if they ever do. So in this graph, the dark areas are the tiny areas of the world's resources occupied by the genus Homo, which, as you can see, had a very bad time, lost most of its species, nearly died out, got down, we think, to about 10,000 breeding pairs at one time, but then has just gone off towards infinity. As you can see up in that top corner of the graph, we reach the uncharted territory, where if human population keeps going up and per capita demands keep going up, as they must, or very likely will, it's hard to see that any of the white space will be left for other species. You often get this argument, oh, it's not the number of people, it's the way they behave, as if humans didn't tend to behave in certain ways, or it's the amount of affluence. And as you can see, the people who say, well, population growth is going to taper off, it's not even going to double from what it's at now, whereas we project economic growth at a rate which means, that we will all be 10,000 times richer by the end of 2 centuries. But in fact, those two lines don't diverge so far, at least in all our experience to date. Population growth drives the demand that produces economic growth. It's human bodies, human beings, that do the consuming and the producing. Here you've got the GDP, that old crude indicator, against the genuine progress indicator that Clive Hamilton and others advocate, and they tend to cross over. GDP goes up, but genuine progress goes down. That can be seen in China and many other countries. That's the alleged figures for Australia. This is really an explanation of the following graph, which shows you how the vast increase in emissions from the USA is largely driven by population growth, only to quite a small degree by per capita. In Europe, where population is much nearer to being stable, they're able to keep a much more stable level of emissions, essentially because their population growth is under control. A very crude thing on what causes emissions. People sometimes say it's just what we rich do. We take too many plane flights, cut them out, and it will all come right. But as this shows, transport's only a relatively small part of emissions, and road is the main cause. It's the lorries and the private vehicles. Air traffic is not so huge as one might imagine. Media indifference to the issue has many causes. The commercial media, of course, do tend to follow the agenda of their owners. And if you've been in business, it is much easier to stay afloat, to make money, to keep your employees paid, to keep your family in shoes, if everything is getting bigger, if there's more money, more activity. However, there is a difference. I think reputable business people write fairly conservative business plans that don't assume you're going to have rampant growth forever and do allow for certain downturns. But it's your get rich quick and take over the world people, the ones that usually wind up in court, like several of the disgraced businessmen I've mentioned. Those are the ones who cannot afford any downturn because they're always mortgaged to the hilt and with the bankers breathing down their necks. And those tend to be the people who demand absolute growth of population and the economy. Unfortunately, they don't all crash. Some of them do take over the world and become very powerful moguls, at least for a time. And they can even put out this totally fallacious, what Ian Lowe calls orchestrated spin and bullshit, according to which we're facing the horrors of population decline. There's a little bit of truth in it. Go to some country towns in Australia and you'll see population decline and some unpleasant effects from it. You notice from the USA that actually people are using birth control. If only immigration was under control, if they had the world average of zero net migration, got the same number of people coming in as out, their population would be on a totally different trajectory, shown by the green area. But it's when you allow constant influx that you then get a country that's both very rich and with enormous growth in population. People moving from poor countries to rich usually double or triple or quadruple their emissions and all their other demands. The average Australian puts out 26 tonnes of greenhouse gases a year. The average person from China 4, and from Britain 11. So wherever you bring people from, you're not just neutrally shuffling them around the world. Finally, these lovely maps from Chris Watson of CSIRO. We know it's a desert continent, but we tend to forget it's also an infertile one. This is the climate map. The green areas are the areas that have sufficient and reliable rainfall. 2 requirements. And parts at the top end have more than sufficient rainfall, but there's nowhere to impound it. And it all comes in about 3 months and is then followed by a searing drought. So he classes them as yellow rather than as green. The point is there's also the map of where the fertility is on this non-volcanic plate where there's only little patches of rich volcanic or alluvial soil. But the real question, you're probably ahead of me, is what are the bits that have got both, that are like the Ukraine, deep, fertile topsoil and sufficient and reliable rainfall? They are those minuscule little bits in dark green, places like Robertson where they filmed Babe, a few other spots. We mainly get by in the yellow areas by growing winter wheat. But for that we need to fertilise heavily. One place where population gets a run is letters to the editor. You get such good things said there. It seems to be the one area where the media will allow these issues. And this is a very good remark from a very bright member of the Sustainable Population Group that I think puts some of the issues in a nutshell. What we can do, get angry is basically my answer. Get informed, get angry. That's why Bill Lyons and I wrote this book. It has made a huge difference. People say, I thought something was wrong with population, but whenever I mentioned it, I got slapped down. Or I went and saw my MP and he said, yes, but what about the ageing population tsunami? Well, nowadays, if the MP tries that, you just say chapter 4. The answers and the refutations are there. It is such a powerful tool to have not only the arguments for population capping, but the answers to all the glib refutations in the one book. We do need to get angry. We do need to put pressure on. Remember that the Australian political system is funded in a highly dubious way by donations from big business, essentially big business, also unions, of course, where they usually fund both the major political parties because they don't want their fortunes to swing on which party is in power. And there's a very interesting legal point. It is illegal to give your shareholders' money to a political organisation if you do it out of political enthusiasm. That's a misuse of the shareholders' money. It is only legal to do it if you're getting something back in return. If you are getting decisions out of government in favour of your company that you could not have got by making reasonable representations to the government, then it's not illegal. But then it's a bribe, isn't it? Oh no, because you're only giving it to the whole party, not to an individual politician. That seems to me a paper-thin distinction, and one we should not have much patience with. That's it. That's all. And I'm happy to debate.